Morning. There, I think, he must quickly have seen what a silly situation he had landed himself in, seeing that for the new arrivals, Russia was even more insignificant and detestable than for those who had gone away, that the vampire needed only Russia's vital fluids, and that the body could wither and perish. The new burgomaster's task was to be in charge not of public-spirited Russians, but of auxiliaries to the German police. But he was fastened to the axle, and now, like it or not, he could only spin. Having freed himself from one lot of butchers, he must help another. The patriotic idea, which he had thought of as diametrically opposed to the Soviet idea, he suddenly saw fused with it in some incomprehensible fashion. Patriotism had slipped away like water through a sieve from the minority who had preserved it and passed to the majority. It was forgotten how people had been shot for patriotism, how it had been ridiculed, and now it was the main stem of someone else's tree. He and others like him must have felt trapped and terrified. The crack had narrowed, and the only way out led to death or katorga. Of course, they were not all Bronovitskys. Of course, many birds of prey, greedy for power and blood, had flocked to that brief feast in time of plague. But their like will flock wherever there are pickings. They were very much at home in the NKVD too. Ch01 was Mamilov, or Antonov, or Dudinsk, or Posiu Chapka. Can anyone imagine fouler butchers? See Volume 2. Yet they lorded it for decades and bled the people dry 100 times over. We shall shortly meet Warder Catch, one of those who managed to fit into both contexts. We have been talking about the towns, but we should not forget the countryside. Liberals nowadays commonly reproach the village with its political obtuseness and conservatism, but before the war, the village, to a man, overwhelmingly, was sober. Much more sober than the town. It took no part at all in the deification of Daddy Stalin, and needless to say, had no time for the world revolution either. The village was quite simply sane and remembered clearly how it had been promised land, then robbed of it, how it had lived, eaten and dressed before an actor collectivization, how calves, ewes and even hens had been taken away from the peasant's yard, how churches had been desecrated and defiled. Even in 1941, the radio's nasal bray was not yet heard in peasant huts, and not every village had even one person able to read the newspapers, so that to the Russian countryside, all those Chang, Solins, MacDonalds, and Hitlers were indistinguishably strange and meaningless lay figures. In a village in Ryazan province on July 3rd, 1941, peasants gathered near the smithy were listening to Stalin's speech relayed by loudspeaker. The man of iron, hitherto unmoved by the tears of Russian peasants, was now a bewildered old gaffer, almost in tears himself. As soon as he blurted out his humbugging brothers and sisters, one of the peasants answered the black paper mouthpiece, "This is what you want, you bastard." And he made in the direction of the loudspeaker a rude gesture much favored by Russians. One hand grips the opposite elbow, and the forearm rises and falls in a pumping motion. The peasants all roared with laughter. If we questioned eyewitnesses in every village, we should learn of 10,000 such incidents, some still more pungent. Such was the mood of the Russian village at the beginning of the war, the mood then of the reservists drinking the last half-liter and dancing in the dust with their kinsmen, while they waited at some wayside halt for a train. On top of all this came a defeat without precedent in Russian memories, as vast rural areas stretching to the outskirts of both capitals and to the Volga, as many millions of peasants shipped from under Kolkhod's rule, and why go on lying and prettifying history? It turned out that the republics only wanted independence, the village only wanted freedom from Kolkhod. The workers' freedom from feudal decrees. If the newcomers had not been so hopelessly arrogant and stupid, if they had not preserved the bureaucratic Kolkhoz administration for Great Germany's convenience, if they had not conceived the obscene idea of turning Russia into a colony, the patriotic cause would not have devolved on those who had always tried to smother it, and we should hardly be called upon to celebrate the 25th anniversary of Russian communism. Somebody someday will have to tell us how the peasants in occupied areas never joined the partisan movement of their own free will, and how, to begin with, they took up arms against the partisans rather than hand over their grain and cattle. Do you remember the great exodus from the Northern Caucasus, January 1943? And can you think of an analogy in world history? A civilian population, and a peasant population at that, leaving with a defeated enemy, with an alien army, rather than stay behind with the victors, their fellow countrymen. The wagon trains rolling as far as the eye could see through its fierce, icy January winds. Here, too, lie the social roots of those hundreds of thousands of volunteers who, monster though Hitler was, were desperate enough to don enemy uniform. The time has come for us to give our views on the Vlasov movement once again. In the first part of this book, the reader was not yet prepared for the whole truth, nor am I in possession of the whole truth. Special studies will be written on the subject, which is for me of secondary importance. There at the beginning, before the reader had traveled the high roads and by roads of Camp World with me, he was merely invited to think. Now, after all those prison transports, transit jails, lumber gang, and camp middens, perhaps the reader will be a little more open to persuasion. In part 1, I spoke of the Vlasovites who took up arms in desperation because they were starving in camp, because their position seemed hopeless. Yet even here there is room for reflection. The Germans began by using Russian prisoners of war only for non-military tasks in the rear, in support of their own troops. And this, you might think, was the best solution for those who only wanted to save their skin. So why did they take up arms and confront the Red Army head-on? But now, since further postponement is impossible, should I not also talk about those who even before 1941 had only one dream, to take up arms and blaze away at those red commissars, Chekists, and collectivizers? Remember Lenin's words, an oppressed class which did not aspire to possess arms and learn how to handle them would deserve only to be treated as slaves. 4th edition, volume 23, page 85. There is then reason to be proud if the Soviet-German war showed that we are not such slaves as all those studies by liberal historians contemptuously made us out to be. There was nothing slavish about those who reached for their sabers to cut off Daddy Stalin's head, nor about those on the other side who straightened their backs for the first time when they put on Red Army greatcoats. In a strange brief interval of freedom which no student of society could have foreseen. These people had experienced on their own hides 24 years of communist happiness, knew by 1941 what as yet no one else in the world knew, that nowhere on the planet, nowhere in history, was there a regime more vicious, more bloodthirsty, and at the same time more cunning and ingenious than the Bolshevik, the self-styled Soviet regime, that no other regime on earth could compare with it in either the number of those it had done to death in hardiness, in the range of its ambitions, in its thoroughgoing and unmitigated totalitarianism. No, not even the regime of its pupil Hitler, which at that time blinded Western eyes to all else. Came the time when the weapons were put in the hands of these people. Should they have curbed their passions, allowed Bolshevism to outlive itself, steeled themselves to cruel oppression again, and only then begun to struggle with it, a struggle which had still hardly started anywhere in the world? No, the natural thing was to copy the methods Bolshevism itself. It had eaten into the body of a Russia sapped by the First World War, and it must be defeated at a similar moment in the Second. Our unwillingness to fight had already shown itself in the Soviet-Finnish War of 1939. V.G. Bazhanov, formerly Secretary of the Politburo and Orgbureau of the CPSU-B, and Stalin's close assistant, tried to exploit this mood, to turn captured Red Army men against the Soviet lines under the command of Russian emigre officers, not to fight their compatriots but to convert them. To attempt was abruptly terminated by the sudden capitulation of Finland. When the Soviet-German War began, 10 years after the slaughterous collectivization, 8 years after the great Ukrainian famine, 6 million dead, unnoticed by neighboring Europe, 4 years after the devil's dance with the NKVD, 1 year after the workers were shackled to new labor laws, and all this when there were 15 million camps about the country, and while the older generation all clearly remembered what life was like before the revolution, the natural impulse of the people was to take a deep breath and liberate itself. Its natural feeling, one of loathing for its rulers, caught us unawares. Numerical superiority in aircraft and tanks. In fact, all-around numerical superiority was enjoyed by the Red Army. It was not this that enabled the enemy so close, so easily, those disastrous salients, taking 300,000 armed men at a time, Bialystok, Smolensk, or 650,000, Bryansk, Kiev. Not that this caused the whole fronts to cave in, and rolled our armies back further and faster than anything Russia had seen in all its 1,000 years, or probably any other country in any other war. Not this, but the instant paralysis of a paltry regime, whose subjects recoiled from it as from a hanging corpse. The Lekoms and the Gorkoms were blown away in 5 minutes, and Stalin was gasping for breath. In 1941, this upheaval might have run its full course. By December, 60 million Soviet people out of the population of 150 million were no longer in Stalin's power. The alarmist note in Stalin's order number 0019, July 16, 1941, was justified. Quote, on all fronts, there are numerous elements who have run to meet the enemy and throw down their arms in first contact with him, unquote. In the Bialystok salient in July 1941, among 340,000 prisoners, there were 20,000 deserters. Stalin thought the situation so desperate that in October 1941, he sent a telegram to Churchill suggesting that 25 to 30 British divisions be landed on Soviet territory. What communist has ever suffered a more complete moral collapse? This was the mood of the time. On August 22, 1941, the commanding officer of the 436th Light Infantry Regiment, Major Kononov, told his regiment to their faces that he was going over to the Germans to join the Liberation Army for the overthrow of Stalin, and invited all who wished to go with him. Not only did he meet no opposition, the whole regiment followed him. Only 3 weeks later, Kononov had created a regiment of Cossack volunteers behind enemy lines. He was a Don Cossack himself. When he arrived at the prisoner of war camp near Mogilev to enlist volunteers, 4,000 of the 5,000 prisoners there declared their readiness to join him, but he could not take them all. In that same year, half the Soviet prisoners of war in the camp near Tilsit, 12,000 men, signed a declaration that the time had come to convert the war into a civil war. We have not forgotten how the whole population of Lokhat Bryansky, before the arrival of the Germans and independently of them, joined in the creation of an autonomous Russian local administration over a large and flourishing province with 8 districts and more than 1 million inhabitants. The demands of the Lokhat Bryansky community were quite precise: a Russian national government to be established, Russians to administer themselves in all the occupied provinces, Russia to be declared independent within its 1938 frontiers, a liberation army to be formed under Russian command, or again a group of young people in Leningrad numbering more than 1,000, led by the student Rudchenko, went out in the woods near Gachina to await the Germans and fight against the Stalin regime. The Germans, however, sent them behind lines to work as drivers and kitchen orderlies. The Germans were met with bread and salt in the villages on the Don. The pre-1941 population of the Soviet Union naturally imagined that the coming of a foreign army meant the overthrow of the communist regime. Otherwise, it would have no meaning for us at all. People expected a political program which would liberate them from Bolshevism. From where to where? From where we were, separated from them by the wilderness of Soviet propaganda, by the dense mass of Hitler's army. How could we readily believe that the Western Allies had entered this war not for the sake of freedom in general, but for their own Western European freedom, only against Nazism, intending to take full advantage of the Soviet armies and leave it at that? Was it not more natural for us to believe that our allies were true to the very principle of freedom, and that they would not abandon us to a worse tyranny? True, these were the same allies for whom Russians had died in the First World War, and who then too had abandoned our army in the moment of collapse, hastening back to their comforts. But this was a lesson too cruel for the heart to learn. Having rightly taught ourselves to disbelieve Soviet propaganda, whatever it said, we naturally did not believe tall stories about the Nazis wishing to make Russia a colony, and ourselves German slaves. Who would expect to find such foolishness in 20th century heads unless he had experienced its effects for himself? Even in 1942, the Russian formation in Ostrov attracted more volunteers than a unit still not fully deployed could absorb, while in the Smolensk region and Belarusia, a volunteer people's militia, 100,000 strong, was formed for the purpose of self-defense against the partisans directed from Moscow. The Germans took affright and banned it. As late as spring 1943, on his 2 propaganda tours in the Smolensk and Chekhov regions, Vlasov was greeted with enthusiasm wherever he went. Even then, the population was still waiting and wondering when we should have our own independent government and our own army. I have testimony from the Pozherovitsky district of the Chekhov Oblast about the friendly attitude of the peasant population to the Vlasov unit there, which refrained from looting and brawling, wore the old Russian uniform, helped with the harvest, and was regarded as Russian organ of authority opposed to the kolkhozism masses, volunteering from among the civilian population, came to sign out, just as they did in Lokot Bryansky with Blatsko-Bionikov's unit, and we are bound to wonder what made them do so. It was not as though they were getting out of a POW camp. In fact, the Germans several times forbade classifieds to take in reinforcements, let them sign on with the police. As late as March 1943, prisoners of war in camp near Kharkov read leaflets about the Vlasov movement, so-called, and 730 officers signed an application to join the Russian Liberation Army. They had the experience of 2 years' war behind them. Many were heroes of the Battle of Stalingrad. Their numbers included divisional commanders and regimental commissars. Moreover, the camp was very well fed, and it was not a desperation of hunger that induced them to sign. The Germans, however, behaved with typical stupidity. Of the 730 who signed, 722 had still not been released from the camp and given the chance to act when the war ended. Even in 1943, tens of thousands of the refugees from the Soviet provinces trailed along behind the retreating German army. Anything was better than remaining under communism. I will go so far as to say that our folk would have been worth nothing at all, a nation of abject slaves, if it had gone through that war without brandishing a rifle at Stalin's government, even from afar, if it had missed its chance to shake its fist and fling a ripe oath at the father of the peoples. The Germans had their generals plot, but what did we have? Our generals were, and remain to this day, non-entities corrupted by party ideology and greed, and have not preserved in their own persons the spirit of the nation, as happens in other countries, so that those who raised their hands and struck were almost to a man from the lowest levels of society. The number of former gentry emigres, former members of the wealthiest strata, and intellectuals taking part was microscopically small. If this movement had been allowed to develop unhindered, to flow with the same force as the first weeks of the war, it would have been like a second Pugachev rising, resembling the first in numbers and social level of those swept in its train. In the weight of popular support, in the part played by the Cossacks in spirit, its determination to settle accounts with evildoers in high places, in a contrast between its elemental force and the weakness of its leadership. However this may be, it was very much more a movement of the people, the common people, than the whole liberation movement of the intelligentsia. From the beginning of the 20th century right up to February 1917, with its pseudo-popular aims and its harvest in October. It was not, however, destined to run its course, but to perish ignominiously, stigmatized as treason to our holy motherland. We have lost the taste for social analysis of events because such explanations are juggled around to suit the need of the moment. But what of our friendship pact with Ribbentrop and Hitler, braggadocio of Molotov and Voroshilov before the war, and then the staggering incompetence, the unpreparedness, the fumbling, and the craven flight of the government from Moscow, the armies abandoned 500,000 at a time, and the salients. Was this not betrayal of the motherland? With more serious consequences, why do we cherish these traitors so tenderly in the apartments on Granovsky Street? Oh, the length of it, the length of the prisoner's bench which seats for all those who tormented and betrayed our people, if we could bring them all, from first to last, to account. Awkward questions get no answers in our country. They are passed over in silence. Instead, this sort of thing, they yell at us. This is the sort of thing they yell at us. Quote, it's a principle, the very principle of the thing. Does any Russian, to achieve his own political ends, however just they appear to him, have the right to lean on the strong arm of German imperialism? And that at the moment of war, to the death, and that at the moment of war, to the death, unquote. True enough, this is a crucial question. Ought you, for what seemed to you noble ends, to avail yourself of the support of German imperialists at war with Russia? Today everyone will join in a unanimous cry of no. What then of the sealed German carriage from Switzerland to Sweden, calling on the way, as we have now learned, at Berlin? The whole Russian press, from the Mensheviks to the cadets, also cried no, but the Bolsheviks explained that it was permissible, that it was indeed ridiculous to reproach them with it. But this is not the only train journey worth mentioning. How many railroad cars did the Bolsheviks rush out of Russia in summer 1918, some carrying foodstuffs, others gold, all of them into Wilhelm's spacious maw. Convert the war into a civil war. This was Lenin's proposal before the Vlasites thought of it. Yes, but his aims remained. Remember what his aims were. Well, what were they? And what has become of them, those aims? Yes, but really, without Wilhelm, the Kaiser, the little emperor, a bit different from Hitler. And anyway, was there really any government in Russia at the time? The provisional government doesn't count. Well, there was a time when, inflamed with martial ardor, we never mentioned the Kaiser in print without the words ferocious or bloodthirsty, and incautiously accused the Kaiser's soldiers of smashing the heads of babes against stones. But let's agree, the Kaiser was different from Hitler. The provisional government, though it was also different. It had no Chekhov, shot no one in the back of the head, imprisoned no one in camps, herded no one into collective farms, poisoned no one's life. The provisional government was not Stalin's government. We must keep things in proportion. Okay. Thank you for listening. Have a good day.